And welcome to the Social Justice Forums. I'm your host, Daren Jaime, and of course, we thank you for joining us. Now, if you are asking the question, what is the show all about? Well, we bring you a forum that's discussing and providing a deeper understanding of the issues and inequities that so many people face. From systemic inequalities to pressing social problems, our guests provide multiple perspectives as well as insights, helping us to better understand and address the challenges. So, we invite you to stay connected to us. The Social Justice Forum starts now. And welcome back. For decades, the American dream promised that working hard, it can lead to wealth as well as financial security, creating what we call upward mobility for those striving to move their families out of the poorest neighborhoods into the most affluent suburban communities. But for middle-class families, the dream is undermined. It's been undermined by a hidden system of local tax structures, private investment patterns, and also federal policies that continue to create disparities in wealth accumulation for Black homeowners as well as suburban communities. And so here we got to today, I should say, to spotlight some things on these issues. She's got a book out called Fighting for a Foothold: How Government and Markets Undermine Black Middle-Class Suburbia. Is the assistant professor of sociology and urban studies at Barnard College-Columbia University, Dr. Angela Sims. And Dr. Sims, thank you so much for joining us here and being with us.
Thank you for having me.
You know, it's great work because I think everybody who's, in the African-American community and throughout knows about Prince George's County, right? One of the most affluent counties, if not, in the United States. And you take this deep dive and say, listen, I want to take a look and see what some things are looking like. First of all, what was the reason for Prince George's County for you?
Well, you named some of it. It is the most affluent county. And so when we think about the concentration of African Americans who have middle class status, and by middle class, and we can unpack this more, thinking about median income or higher, college degree, white collar work. So Prince George's County is a local jurisdiction that has the highest concentration of those people. So you might think of Atlanta, you might think of Houston, and the Black middle class in those areas are more spread out. So Prince George's County, in many ways, is an extreme case. So it's a best case scenario for Black affluence. So then, as a sociologist, the warrant there is to see in this best case scenario where you have the ideal conditions, shall we say, for overcoming the ongoing and historical experiences that Black people face in terms of racial discrimination. The question is, to what extent does Prince George's County overcome those things and actually realize, as you were saying, the American dream?
Yeah. So you take this book and it's a culmination of great work, and I mean a long time there. How long was this book in process?
Well, if you mark it from data collection, we're talking about 10 years. The book process itself was about 6 years. So this is definitely a labor of love that I have been doing for some time.
Yeah. When we talk about suburbia, right, I think a lot of people make that trek. They live in the inner city. Sometimes in many inner cities, it's rough. And the goal is, I want to be close to the community, but I don't want to be in the community. And they make this trek to suburbia. As you assess suburbia from Prince George's County, what were some of the things you came up with?
Well, as you said, one of the things that we want to think about is people migrating to the peripheries of cities as part of their experience of upward mobility. So what they're realizing then is more space, right? Often the single-family home is the iconic unit that they're seeking, so non-detached. They're thinking about access to public goods like high-quality public schools. They're thinking about essentially the realization of their economic experiences in geographic form. And so Prince George's County, also because it's majority Black and middle class, gives people the opportunity to stay in majority Black space and to be proximate to the District of Columbia, which is also the engine for the DC metro area. So I think one of the things you're picking up on is that it's important to think not just about cities and suburbs as distinct, but really about metropolitan areas and how people and goods move across those jurisdictions to realize their interests.
Getting back to PG County, I mean, obviously when you think about that, the automatic assumption is there's going to be better schools, there's going to be better services, right? And, that's always true about black suburbs.
Right. So one of the things that we have to think about is that regardless of whether you're in a city or you're in a suburb, both of those are local units that are creatures of states, meaning state constitutions confer authority to local jurisdictions. And so one of the authorities they confer to local jurisdictions, cities or suburban counties, is taxing authority. And so what we have to appreciate then is it's the racial composition of the local jurisdiction, the racial composition and the class composition of those jurisdictions that really drive the capacity of those local jurisdictions to have the tax revenue sufficient for supporting high quality public goods and services. And so what supports that tax revenue is your tax base. Your tax base is the cumulative value, market value of residential and commercial properties. So Black people have the inheritance intergenerationally of experiencing at the individual and household level underinvestment. So we can think about the barriers they face to education, the barriers they face to upward mobility through jobs. And so there's that intergenerational lack of wealth that reflects that history from slavery forward, but then also the ways in which Black spaces have been underinvested in. And so in both cases, both the people and the spaces have been underinvested in. And that's also, it's not just an underinvestment, but it's also an extraction process. So we can think about the fact that Black people have been paying taxes all along since slavery, and then they were not receiving the same reward. So separate but equal, we know, was never equal.
Right.
And we know that even today, that inheritance plus the ongoing extractive processes mean that Black people can't realize the same tax base. So then that means they have to either levy a higher tax rate and in order to get the same revenue as white folk get in their majority white spaces, or levy the same tax rate and actually yield less revenue, which means less investment in their public goods and services. So what I'm arguing is that this long-standing asymmetry of resources across racial groups that was really instantiated through the Constitution and federal, state, and local laws is still with us. So even when Black people experience upward mobility, even when they attain middle class status, they're still facing these barriers because we haven't actually redistributed the wealth and the political power that goes along with it.
And you took time, doing interviews and talking to stakeholders involved in this. As you unpacked this process, different than what you thought?
Yes, I mean, in some ways I had an intuition. I'd done my reading, as any good
Right.
scholar would. People like Mary Patillo have written books like Black Picket Fences. Karen Lacey has written a book called Blue Shade Black. So I had done my due diligence to understand what scholars knew about Black spaces, both in suburbia and in cities. What surprised me when I came to Prince George's County in 2016, 2017, was that they were still recovering from the Great Recession. So they were still experiencing the downstream, the effects of the foreclosure crisis, because we know that Black people were targeted, back to this extraction point, they were targeted by Wells Fargo, Bank of America, other mortgage lenders and major banks who, by the way, were too big to fail. The government bailed them out. But so after they extract from Black communities with these toxic assets, irrespective of Black people's creditworthiness, irrespective of other factors that should have determine what kind of mortgages they received, those banks and financial entities were too big to fail. They were bailed out by the government. But Main Street and MLK Boulevard, shall we say,
right.
they were left to figure it out for themselves. So Prince George's County, again, showing you the precarity that the Black middle class faces, irrespective of economic cycle. They were already dealing with this chronic fiscal precarity that reflects what I was describing before about the capacity of the tax base. And then now you have this acute shock that comes from the effects of the foreclosure crisis. And of course, the revenue that's coming into government is going down when you have people out of work due to the recession. When Black homes are foreclosed upon, those banks are usually paying taxes, but we can think about how the market value of homes and neighborhoods is going down because now you have vacant properties that are now depressing the market value of those spaces. So then that has implications then for the revenue the county is bringing in, and the demand, by the way, is not going down. In fact, the demand is going up during a recession. Why? Because people have fewer household resources. So you can see how there's this sort of vice that's happening. I call it a vicious fiscal cycle that's happening, that's reinforcing on both sides of the ledger, both in terms of what you're bringing in as a jurisdiction and the burdens on your budget, what your residents are needing, creating this particular kind of fiscal constraint. And I argue that this vicious fiscal cycle in Prince George's County is complemented by virtuous fiscal cycles in wider, wealthier jurisdictions because they're benefiting from proximity to these Black spaces in terms of the flows of people and capital. And so really trying to connect the dots across metropolitan area jurisdictions to think about how the economic capacity of individual jurisdictions is really tethered to the economic capacity of its jurisdictional neighbors.
So about economic capacity, Black middle class suburbs oftentimes more affordable, right, than other areas, but more affordable doesn't always do justice, right? It creates some pressure. What are some of these pressures that are created in this particular way?
So one thing to to note first is that affordability is double-edged. So
Right.
affordability means it's more accessible because I'm gonna pay less to live there. But affordability in this case for Black folk is also reflecting this long-standing underinvestment in Black people and in Black spaces and the relative wealth accumulation that the white jurisdictions have, right? So it's a relative measure, and it's also capturing the historical and ongoing effects. So the affordability means that yes, Black folk can have a single-family home, let's say in Prince George's County, it's say a median home value of say $350,000. In neighboring Fairfax County, whiter, wealthier county, it's probably $450,000, $500,000. Neighboring Montgomery County, Maryland, something similar. So we can say, okay, Black people have a more accessible route to that middle-class experience of a single-family home in Prince George's. But what that means, though, is that the value of that home is going to generate less tax revenue than for Prince George's County to then provide the public goods and services that residents want. And so then what that means is not only then do you have these middle class folk that are buying these $350,000 homes, but because it's more affordable, it also leaves more room for people who are more economically distressed. So if we think of quintiles, fifths, you have that middle rung. This is the median. People that have the income right at the center. But Prince George's County is going to have people at that median and then below, whereas the whiter, wealthier counties have people at the median, but then a lot more people in the fourth and fifth quintile. And so what that means is that Prince George's County is now responsible for more of the low-income residents in the D.C. metropolitan area, which is why we're saying you have to think about flows of people in capital in the metro area. So, for example, Prince George's County has the concentration of undocumented immigrants who tend to, on average, be lower income and whose children tend to need more resources in public schools. Gentrification in D.C. also means that people who are moderate income and economically distressed are also coming to Prince George's. So now you not only have this property tax revenue that's lower because you undervalue Black people in Black spaces, but now on the other side of the ledger, you have more pressure on the budget from higher needs residents. And so that compounding effect is only important for understanding Prince George's, but it also shows you that by virtue of these other jurisdictions, whiter, wealthier jurisdictions, having more of the conditions for a growing tax base and fewer people who are higher needs, they can continue to reinvest in their public goods and services and have that quality grow and therefore increase the demand for the housing, which is what? Increase the value of those properties. So they have this virtuous fiscal cycle. And so I'm arguing that virtuous fiscal cycle is tethered to this vicious fiscal cycle that the Black jurisdiction faces.
I want to talk a little bit about you for a second, because you served in the federal government 7 years, right?
I did.
Right, Presidential Management Fellow and Legislative Analyst at the Office of Management and Budget during the George Bush administration and also the Obama administration.
Right.
That means you know government, right?
I was government.
Right, so as I look at this matter, and you put your government hat on, how do we correct this? Where's the correction coming?
Yeah, I mean, so the policy solutions are definitely at the center of the conclusions of my book, and so I kind of think of them at different scales and different time periods, and even sort of when I say scales, orders of magnitude and different sort of time horizons. So one, I think, is to think about, as I was just saying, when we think about metro areas, is how because, especially since the 1970s, the federal government has essentially been either holding steady or decreasing its investment in what we would call pro-social, pro-human, and other human services. So we're talking about health care, education, support to state and local governments. It has decreased, its revenue in those areas or held it flat. At the same time, as we know, they've increased their budgets for what? The carceral state and for policing. So one thing to think about in terms of a set of policy solutions is, one, increasing revenue for the federal government by taxing people who are upper middle class and higher, particularly the people who are very, very rich, and then also corporations, so that you have more money in the public fisc in the first place. Then once the money's in the public fisc, we need to make sure that that money goes towards the pro-social things that we know actually support human development. And so that's at the federal level. Then at the metro and state level, we need to think about how increasingly, because of that federal underinvestment, but also state investment is either been flat or decreased, is thinking about how local jurisdictions are forced to compete with each other for residents who are high income and for businesses that invest in their jurisdictions. And so you don't want the liquor store, you want the economic development that will have these compounding dividends. You want investments in tech, you want investments in healthcare, so it attracts those kinds of workers, the businesses that have the knock-on effects. That's what grows your economy. So Prince George's County has to compete with these wider, wealthier jurisdictions for those same kinds of investments. In order to entice people to come to their jurisdiction, they often have to give more tax incentives. So that means offering businesses an opportunity to pay less than they otherwise would in taxes, which undermines the very point, which is that we need tax revenue. So what I'm arguing then is states and the federal government need to intervene in this process of encouraging this competition, because what that does is just amplify, it brings through the long-standing effects that Black people have experienced from slavery forward, and essentially doubles down on it, right? So you underinvest in Black people and Black space, and then you say, oh, by the way, raise all your revenue for sustaining yourself, clean drinking water, schools, roads, on the very things we've underinvested in, right? So that's a policy choice. So I believe we need to tax different things that are more equitable, that would yield a more even distribution. I think states and federal government should invest more in public goods and services, so local jurisdictions are less responsible for them. And then I think we need to think about different forms of what I call Black equity funds or reparations, which essentially I argue we need to put as much energy into correcting the harm as we did to creating Jim Crow and these harms in the first place.
Right.
And then we need to imagine social systems designed for human flourishing. Because even if we have reparations, but we don't actually correct these systems of exploitation, we're going to need reparations again. So really it's taking a step back and thinking about what kinds of lessons have we learned over time in terms of how we invest in people and spaces that really honor the histories of groups in terms of how they've experienced this country over the last several hundred years, and then how do we want to move forward? So on this 250th anniversary of our country, I argue we need a reckoning. I argue we need to finally, as Grandma would say, call a thing,
right,
and honor the fact that you have built a country on enslavement and on genocide. And effectively, as a Christian, I'm saying this is common grace. We ought to be grateful we have that things are as good as they are. And let's take that grace and say yes to the Lord and say, let justice roll down, right? Let us actually do the repair work and then envision that life of abundance for all of us to flourish, not just the few at the expense of the many, which is what we have right now.
When you look at right now, right, administrative policies that are coming out from federal mandates,
right,
executive orders, the whole 9 yards, how much further back does the clock get set back in the work that you're talking about right now?
Before I answer, let me just sort of have a historical perspective. I often, my second project right now is tentatively named Footholds of Flourishing. So before I answer about this current moment, I think it's important to mark the fact that Black people have come through chattel slavery, that we've had Reconstruction, that was about 12 years after the Civil War ended in 1865. Then we had Jim Crow. Then we have the World War II modern civil rights movement, and then now we're moving into our contemporary period. So Black people have been at this for a long time. So I always want to acknowledge that I stand on the shoulders of people like W.E.B. Du Bois and Fannie Lou Hamer and Ida B. Wells and Angela Davis, people who have been at this for a long time, the Black Panthers who have been visioning. And so I want to be careful to remember that this administration is not an aberration, but fundamentally constitutive of the long history of Black people's experience in this country. So things like political violence, W.E.B. Du Bois and Black Reconstruction chronicles how literally people are mowed down at the polls as they're trying to vote right after Reconstruction, essentially after the federal troops leave the South. It's really not until 1965, which is why you needed a Voting Rights Act,
right,
that you actually see Black people voting in mass in southern states. So this is not new. And so this administration, in many ways, Make America Great Again, it's really signaling. They want to go back to the prior regime. And so they're not concerned about saying the quiet part out loud. We had a moment where where you at least were gesturing toward inclusion under the auspices at least of the 14th Amendment, equal protection of the laws. There was some sense that the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65, the Fair Housing Act of 68 required some sort of government action. And certainly there was meaningful action. That's how you have a Black middle class. But even that Black middle class shows you that precarity still exists because you've never really redistributed resources and power. And we have to remember that the Black middle class is burgeoning at the same time that you have the rise of mass incarceration, which is why I mentioned that we've had growth in the carceral state, but not growth in social services and health and education. And so to get to your question, with all of that context, I think that this administration sets us back in particular ways in terms of the kinds of institutions that they've been attacking. So I'm in academia, we've been a target, and that's not to say that there aren't things that academia needs to correct in terms of inequities, but certainly what this administration has offered has not been a solution to that, but just exacerbated many of the inequities that were already there. We can think about investment in public goods and services, which is the core of my work. So I do think that this administration sets us back in certain ways, but I also think this administration administration has been clarifying. If we look at what's happened in Minnesota recently in terms of even the response to the immigration enforcement, I think it's caused, many people have started using the playbooks of the modern civil rights movement, what the Black Panthers use, what the Southern Christian Leadership Conference used, what the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Commission used. A lot of protest strategies that really, I think, help us to see what our power is, right? We may not have the guns, we may not have the money, but we have power. And one of the things that people in power, regardless of what they own and how much they own, one of the things they fear the most, is sort of axiomatic of sociology, is anomie, the loss of social control. And so we have bodies, right? We have to all reenact society every day. Social reproduction means, we get up, we mostly expect the trains to kind of run on time,
right.
To be able to go to the grocery store, live our lives, but that all requires all of us to coordinate. So when we coordinate to say, actually no, we don't co-sign this, that's when we see movement. The difficulty is, of course, we have to coordinate that when we have to sustain it. Those who have disproportionate resources can wait us out. And that's why economic strikes of a great magnitude take time and coordination. That's what I mean by these different time horizons. We need to start to figure things out at smaller scales, and then figure out how to coordinate things at larger scale. And certainly we have technology that can support us in doing that, but there's nothing like face-to-face community building. And so that's why the Black church, for example, was so central to the modern civil rights movement, because it was a place where we were able to know each other. We understood that people with children probably can't do certain things by virtue of their responsibilities. Professors who were single, who have more latitude in how they use their time, can enact certain kinds of behaviors and sustain certain kinds of things. So part of it is being in community and really amplifying each other's strengths, each other's capacities, so that we can each contribute to this longer fight. But I do think that this administration, if we reframe it, it's clarifying. It's showing us the stakes. It's showing us the vulnerability we all face. It's different levels of vulnerability, different mechanisms of vulnerability given our race, class, and gender. But we're seeing that, as Lincoln said, during the Civil War, a house divided against itself cannot stand, and that's really biblical. That's really right. Jesus, reminding us, as he said in Matthew 6, you cannot serve God and money. A divided heart will eventually, start to implode on itself. It cannot sustain itself. And so that's what I meant by this common grace, that we ought to be grateful for what we do have in this country thus far, but we ought to see that it's fundamentally still built on this foundation of slavery and genocide, and the logics, as it were, logics meaning the rewards and privileges that went into that system. And we've never really repudiated that. We've never really replaced this idea that some people don't warrant full human regard. That's the toxic aspect. That's what we mean by racial capitalism. Profit generation based on racial difference, which is to create the idea that there are subspecies of human beings. There is one species, Homo sapien. And so, we use physical features to assign people to racial categories like skin tone, but they don't actually map to human variation. So this lie, as Dorothy Roberts called it, a political category, is used then to justify different treatment for different people based on racial status. And so we need to really sit with the implications of that and how it really distorts all of our social systems. And then, as I said, do that work. That's the renewing of the mind, that Paul talks about in Romans 12. Be ye not conformed to the patterns of this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind. The renewing of our mind is to see the imago Dei in everybody, and then to imagine social systems that really reflect the truth of that.
I wonder about Black Wall Street, right? I think about a time when, Black Americans saw prosperity at a time like that. Then I think about your work, right? And I think about, what if Black Wall Street was still existing, and where would you see, or could you make a correlation, if you will, between that and what we're seeing here today? Would things be improved, or potentially could we be seeing different? I don't know.
Yeah, well, I think this is what I was talking about with the footholds of flourishing. So I think we really want to honor that Black folk have figured a lot of things out, right? It's just that often when we build it, it's burned down, right? So we think about Reconstruction, Black people, that's when we start our historically Black colleges and universities. We have doctors, lawyers, engineers that are coming through those institutions. We have churches, we have businesses. And so the Black Wall Streets that you're talking about are multi, right? We can think about Tulsa as among the most famous because it's burned to the ground. But you can think about Black Wall Streets in places like Haiti and the Durham area, North Carolina. You can think about places like Richmond, Virginia, some places in the South as well as in the North, places like Harlem, where I currently live. So, so we definitely want to honor the fact that Black people have had these concentrations of flourishing and prosperity, and then over time they're undermined. Sometimes literally undermined through arson and other kinds of violence. So Bloody Summer, the summer of 1919, the year after World War I ends, is really bloody. Why? Because you now have black soldiers who thought they were fighting for the double V, victory over fascism abroad, victory over fascism and racism here, and they come back, and some of the, to me, most arresting images are black people lynched in their uniforms, right? Which is this signal, get back in your place, right? Thank you for your service, get back in your place. And so we can think about a lot of Black Wall Streets and other, Rosewood, Eatonville, these places that are where Rosewood is also burned down, but these black spaces, as you said, that are undermined over time. So I think even though they don't make it, they're a testament to our resilience, to our brilliance, and I think we don't lose them ultimately. They're embedded in our sort of collective psyche of what we know is possible. I think of scholars like Jessica Nimhard, who also honor the ways in which black folk have been imagining even how to meet their economic and political needs outside of capitalism. So using things like mutual aid and cooperatives, right? So credit unions and other ways of essentially sharing amongst each other that are not profit driven. And so yes, we can certainly think about how we might have continued to thrive even more had these Black Wall Streets made it. I think that sort of, stands to reason, right? That being able to keep that helps. But I also think that we don't lose the lessons learned from those things. We can keep paying those. We can keep referencing those and mining them for wisdom. And it shows us what's possible. But also, this point about violence being at the heart of this country. I think we really have to sit with that and think about how, again, if we want to have a stable country, the shalom of nothing missing, nothing broken, we actually have to build it. And then we have to be intentional about that. So black people in many ways have been the ones, I think, writing the script for that. Yeah. We've been trying to get us all free, not just black folk free, but everybody free. When we get free, everybody's free. Exactly.
Totally.
Exactly.
I only have a couple minutes left, literally
Sure.
a couple minutes left. But I got a couple questions for you. Number one, what do you want people to take away from your book?
Let's see. The core message is that the black middle class is capable and resilient, but does not have the same resources as the white middle class. And so if we're going to actually have equity across class statuses, we need to have a tax system that honors the historical realities of this country. And so that means that the federal and state governments need to step up in terms of funding public goods and services so that we actually correct for the historical harms and address the ongoing disparities in resources across households, neighborhoods, and local governments. And then beyond that, I think it's a call to Americans to really envision, as I said, a broader sense of what it means to flourish. And so I think it's culling from the wisdom, as we were just describing, of what black people have been doing. So the book, is really a social science text that is more broadly offering us, I hope, a truth that allows us to build together.
And lastly, where do we get the book?
Oh, sure. On most of your major outlets, for sure. So Amazon, Barnes and Noble. If you want to, steer clear of the major corporations, the Russell Sage Foundation is the publisher, and then my website is drangelaSims.com, Sims with 2 M's.com, and so you can connect to all of those outlets through my website as well.
Great work, great conversation, and really, I think it's something we need to really pay attention to. I think it's a gap, and your work really talks about, filling one of those gaps, and hopefully we can work together. Your work can be a part of bridging that gap. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Dr. Angela Sims, thank you so much for being with us. All right, listen, what you know, we come to the end of our show today. Hope you enjoyed this week's discussion on the Social Justice Forum. If you want to rewatch this week's episode, recatch the cablecast right here on Bronxnet.org. If not, if you want to join the conversation also and share your point of view, social media, we're always doing that. Join us there, Bronxnet TV, and join us next week. We continue to elevate the conversation and have some further discussion, bringing further awareness across the globe. I am your host, Daren Jaime, saying take care and God bless.